Today we'll be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one takes us to an Illinois cave, where four experienced cavers pushed into a water-filled passage that became their tomb. While the second one involves a guide who took everyone beyond safety point for reasons we'll never know. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On December 3rd, 2011, four experienced cavers gathered at the entrance of a remote Illinois cave, prepared for their most challenging expedition yet. Chad McCain, Todd McCartney, Ralph Sawyer, and Jason Kern planned to spend 10 to 16 hours underground, pushing through water-filled passages with dangerously low airspace of only 6 to 10 inches. McCain was the newcomer to this specific cave system. McCartney, at 44, was the veteran who had explored these passages multiple times. Sawyer and Kern rounded out the experienced team. Their target was a water-filled section that had been challenging explorers for years, requiring cavers to crawl through frigid water with faces pressed against rocky ceilings. McCartney came prepared with extra cold water protection, wearing a neoprene hoodie over his wetsuit. The others had standard caving gear, knowing the cold would be their constant enemy. The water temperature would be brutally cold, and the low airspace meant panic could easily become a death trap. The four men entered the cave system and worked their way toward the water-filled passage. When they reached their target area, the reality became clear. The passage stretched ahead, filled with dark, cold water that reflected their headlamps. The ceiling dropped until there was barely enough space to keep their heads above water. McCain volunteered to lead upstream, despite being new to this cave. As he entered the water, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The water was 3 to 4 feet, 0.9 to 1.2 meters, deep, but the low ceiling forced him to crawl in an awkward position. He held his helmet in his hand to gain clearance, pressing his face against the rocky ceiling. The airspace dropped to 6 inches, then lower, until McCain encountered a section where the ceiling came within only 3 inches of the water surface. This was beyond dangerous territory with essentially zero margin for error. McCain hesitated, studying the passage and weighing the risks. McCartney, watching from behind, saw McCain's hesitation and made a fatal decision. His extra cold water protection gave him confidence to push further. He decided to take the lead, leaving his pack with the group to reduce his profile in the water. Holding his helmet in front for protection, McCartney moved past McCain and continued upstream. The water was freezing, but his neoprene gear provided enough insulation. He pressed his nose against the ceiling, breathing through minimal airspace as he pushed deeper into unexplored territory. The sensation was claustrophobic and terrifying. McCartney was essentially swimming through a water-filled tunnel with barely enough air to breathe. Every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. Panic would be fatal within seconds. McCartney continued for 40 feet, 12 meters beyond McCain's furthest advance, entering territory no human had ever explored. The passage twisted and turned, with the ceiling varying from 3 to 4 inches above the water surface. He was completely committed now, too far from safety to turn back quickly. As McCartney rounded a bend in the passage, the nightmare scenario unfolded. The passage didn't just continue straight ahead, it angled sharply downward. The ceiling that had been barely manageable at 3 inches suddenly dropped even lower, while the water level remained the same. In the bend, there was virtually no airspace left. McCartney found himself facing a water-filled tube with no room for his head above the surface. He tried to back up, but the tight confines made it nearly impossible to reverse direction quickly. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped in a flooded section with no air pocket. His lungs burned as he held his breath, desperately trying to find a way forward or back, but the bend had become a death trap. The cold water rushed over his face as he struggled against the rock walls, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as oxygen deprivation began to take hold. Then, everything went wrong. The others heard the first sounds of distress from around the bend. McCartney began kicking and thrashing in the water, his movements becoming increasingly desperate. At first, the team thought he might have found a section with more airspace and was working through a difficult spot. But the thrashing continued, becoming more alarming. McCartney's light was visible around the bend, but his movements were clearly those of someone in serious trouble. The controlled motions of an experienced caver had been replaced by frantic struggles of someone fighting for their life. McCain called out to McCartney, but there was no response. The thrashing became more violent, followed by periods of ominous silence. McCain moved upstream as quickly as possible in the restricted space, calling for his friend. When McCartney's light suddenly came into view, McCain's worst fears were confirmed. McCartney was clearly in trouble, his movements uncontrolled and desperate. Then McCain watched in horror as McCartney went underwater and didn't come back up. When he finally surfaced, he was floating face down next to the wall, completely motionless. McCain and Sawyer rushed forward, but the confined space made rescue attempts incredibly difficult. In the very low airspace with cold water and limited room to maneuver, even reaching McCartney was a challenge. Sawyer, overwhelmed by the situation and confined space, momentarily panicked. He went underwater, struggling against fear and claustrophobia that threatened to claim another victim. When he popped up in a small air bell, he had lost his helmet and light, cutting his face on the sharp rock wall. Now they had two people in distress and rapidly diminishing light sources. McCain knew time was critical. McCartney had been underwater for precious seconds, and brain damage could occur quickly without oxygen. McCain finally reached McCartney after about 45 seconds that felt like hours. He grabbed the unconscious man and began dragging him downstream toward Kern, fighting against the current and confined space. The nearest place to get McCartney completely out of the water was still over 600 feet, 183 meters away. McCain found a section with only 10 inches of water and more than a foot of airspace, enough to begin emergency treatment. When they rolled McCartney over, his condition was terrifying. His eyes were glassy and caked with mud, showing no signs of consciousness. McCain immediately began CPR, working in cramped conditions to restart his friend's breathing and heart. Sawyer and Kern joined the effort, working together to keep McCartney's head out of water while administering rescue breaths. The minutes that followed were the longest of their lives. In the cold, dark confines of the cave, with limited equipment and no possibility of outside help, they fought to save McCartney's life. McCain continued CPR while the others supported his efforts, knowing their friend's survival depended entirely on their actions. After 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours, McCartney suddenly regained consciousness. The relief was overwhelming, but they knew they weren't out of danger yet. They moved him another 30 feet, 9 meters, downstream to a mud bank where he could sit up and recover. Now they faced new challenges. They had to get McCartney out of the cave quickly, but with very few remaining light sources. Sawyer and McCartney had both lost their helmets and primary lights during the emergency. McCartney only had one extra mag light, Sawyer had a couple of small mag lights, and Kern had one small secondary headlamp. McCain, who had been better prepared with backup lighting, shared his extra Apex and Phoenix lights with the others. But even with these resources, they were operating with minimal illumination for what would be a long and difficult journey to the surface. Working their way back toward the entrance, McCartney started off slow and lethargic. He coughed up water frequently, his body still recovering from the near-drowning experience. But gradually, he began to pick up speed, his strength returning as they moved away from the accident scene. The journey out was a nightmare of endurance and determination. They had to navigate a 300-foot-long, 91 meters crawl that explorers nicknamed the bathtub because it contained water with only 6 inches of airspace. Under normal circumstances, this would have been challenging but manageable. With an injured team member and limited lighting, it became a test of survival. McCain came up with an innovative solution for getting McCartney through the bathtub crawl. He tethered 2 Swago packs to his waist. These waterproof and buoyant packs created a makeshift flotation device. McCartney could rest his head and chest on the packs while McCain pulled him through the section. The technique worked, but it was exhausting for both men. McCain had to drag his friend through 300 feet, 91 meters, of water-filled passage while navigating the cramped conditions himself. McCartney, still recovering from his near drowning, had to trust completely in his friend's ability to get him to safety. Hour after hour, they worked their way through the cave system. Every obstacle seemed magnified by their circumstances. As they neared the entrance, they encountered one final challenge. The entrance required a short climb. The team rigged a rope system, with some members helping from above and others supporting from below. Finally, 6 hours after entering the cave and 3.5 hours after the accident, all 4 men emerged into the winter air. McCartney was immediately taken to the hospital, where he spent 4 days recovering from his ordeal. The doctors confirmed that he had come very close to drowning and that the quick action of his friends had saved his life. The cold water had actually helped preserve his brain function during the period when he was unconscious. While the people in the first story survived, luck didn't favor the group involved in the next one. It was late afternoon of April 19th, 2012, in Cenote, Chac, Mool, as tourists began packing up their gear for the day. Located in the heart of Quintana Roo, Mexico, this popular diving spot has welcomed countless visitors, seeking to explore its crystal-clear underwater caverns. But as closing time approached, 3 people were about to make a decision that would turn their dream vacation into a nightmare. Carlos had been guiding divers at Cenote, Chac, Mool for 2 years. At 28, he was confident in his abilities and knew every twist and turn of the cavern system. He had performed hundreds of cavern dives, always staying within the safe zone where natural light could still penetrate the water. But Carlos had a secret that his clients never knew about. He wasn't certified to lead cave diving trips into the deeper, darker parts of the Cenote system. That afternoon, as the Cenote prepared to close for the day, Carlos met his latest clients. Marina and Eduardo were a young Brazilian couple on their honeymoon, still glowing with the excitement of newlyweds. They had saved for months to afford this trip to Mexico's Riviera Maya, and cave diving was at the top of their bucket list. Eduardo, 26, and Marina, 24, were newer to the sport but eager to experience the underwater world that had captivated them. The couple had booked their dive for later in the day, hoping to avoid the crowds that typically gathered at the popular Cenote during peak hours. They arrived just 1 hour before closing time, their excitement barely contained as they suited up in their gear. As they prepared their equipment, Carlos made a decision that would haunt the diving community for years to come. He had been in the cavern system earlier that day and had noticed something interesting deeper in the cave zone. There was a section he had explored before, well beyond the safe cavern area, where the rock formations were particularly stunning. The 3 divers entered the water as the Cenote staff began their closing procedures. Other divers were already heading back to the surface, their day of exploration complete. Carlos led Marina and Eduardo through the initial underwater passages, pointing out the stalactites and limestone formations that made cenotes so popular with divers worldwide. The water was perfectly clear, visibility extending for dozens of meters in every direction. Schools of small fish darted between the rock formations, while shafts of sunlight created an almost cathedral-like atmosphere underwater. Marina swam close to Eduardo, her eyes wide with wonder behind her diving mask. This was exactly what they had dreamed their honeymoon would be like. As they swam deeper into the Cenote, Carlos began leading them away from the designated cavern zone. The natural light from the surface grew dimmer, but the couple trusted their guide completely. They had no way of knowing that they were entering an area that required advanced cave diving certification and specialized equipment. The transition from cavern to cave happened gradually. The overhead openings to the surface became fewer and smaller until they disappeared entirely. They were now in the dark zone, a place where only experienced cave divers should venture. Carlos had dive lights, but he underestimated how quickly the situation could become dangerous. About 80 meters, 262 feet, from the surface, roughly an 8-minute swim in ideal conditions, Carlos began to realize his mistake. The passage ahead split into multiple tunnels, and he wasn't entirely sure which route would lead them back to the cavern zone. The rock formations that had seemed so beautiful moments before now appeared menacing in the beam of his dive light. Marina was the first to show signs of distress. Cave diving requires special techniques and mental preparation that cavern divers don't typically possess. The overhead environment, with no direct route to the surface, began to trigger anxiety. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming her air supply much faster than normal. Eduardo noticed his wife's distress and tried to signal to Carlos, but the guide was focused on finding the correct passage back to safety. The dive line that should have marked their route was visible just a few feet away. But in the darkness and confusion, Carlos missed its significance. As Marina's air supply dwindled, panic began to set in. She tried to swim upward, looking for a way to the surface, but found only solid rock overhead. The realization that she was trapped underground, with no direct route to air, overwhelmed her completely. Her movements became erratic and desperate. Eduardo, seeing his wife in distress, made the fatal decision to share his air with her. In open water, this might have been possible, but the stress and confusion of the cave environment made it nearly impossible to execute safely. Both newlyweds were now consuming Eduardo's air supply at a dangerous rate. Carlos finally realized the severity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina had already inhaled water as her air supply ran out completely. Eduardo, trying desperately to save his wife, had exhausted his own air attempting to get her to the surface. The guide, watching his clients die before his eyes, made frantic efforts to get them back to safety. But the distance to the cavern zone was too great. In the darkness of the cave, with no natural light to guide them, all three divers became disoriented. Eduardo still had some air remaining in his tank, but it had been too little, too late to save anyone. Above the surface, the Cenote had officially closed for the day. Staff members noticed that Carlos and his clients hadn't returned, but several hours passed before anyone became seriously concerned. It wasn't unusual for guides to take their time with clients, and the assumption was that they were simply taking a longer route or making additional stops. As the evening wore on and there was still no sign of the three divers, concern grew into alarm. Emergency services were finally notified, and a search and rescue operation began. Cave diving rescue teams were called in from across the region, understanding that time was critical in any underwater emergency. The search teams entered the water with powerful lights and specialized equipment, following the most likely routes that a cavern dive might have taken. They checked the designated cavern areas first, then expanded their search into the cave zone when no trace of the missing divers was found. Shortly before 2 a.m. on April 20th, the search teams made the tragic discovery. The three bodies were found deep in the cave zone, far beyond where any cavern dive should have ventured. The positioning of the bodies told a story of confusion and panic, with all three divers facing away from the exit, lost in the darkness. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of the tragedy. Carlos, despite his experience in the Cenote, was not certified to lead cave diving trips. His clients, Marina and Eduardo, were qualified only for cavern diving and had no training for the overhead environment they had entered. The combination of an unqualified guide and inadequately trained divers had created a deadly situation. The diving community was shocked by the incident, particularly because it highlighted a known problem at Cenote, Chac, Mool. Local cavern dive guides had been reported to frequently venture into the cave zone, often having to be warned or chased out by properly certified cave divers. The pressure to provide clients with unique experiences had led to dangerous risk-taking. Marina and Eduardo's families were devastated by the loss. The young couple had been married only months before, with their whole lives ahead of them. Their dream honeymoon had turned into an unimaginable tragedy that would forever change their families' lives.